Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Facebook Live Essential Geopolitics with myself, Ryan Bohl, and Emily Hawthorne. And today we are going to be discussing something that broke this morning, a topic that is near and dear to both of us, as both of us were former residents of the United Arab Emirates. But the president of that country, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, passed away this morning at the age of 73. And we're here to talk about some of the implications of that, what that might mean for both the UAE and the rest of the region, as well as what it might mean for what this might look like as other countries are also looking at their looming succession challenges. So, yeah, Emily, if you want to kind of start us off, like who was Sheikh Khalifa for people who might not be aware? What does this mean within the UAE context?
Yeah, Sheikh Khalifa, Allah yarhamu, is the really one of the key rulers in the history of this relatively young nation. From 2004 until 2014, he was actively leading the country as president of the United Arab Emirates, which, for those who don't know, is a federation of seven emirates. Abu Dhabi, the largest and the wealthiest, sort of being the real heavyweight among those United Emirates. And in 2014, sadly, he had a stroke, and a lot of the duties that were not already in the hands of the current crown prince, Mohammed bin Zayed, all the rest of the duties of president sort of went to Mohammed bin Zayed. But before that stroke, before that sad event, he was really guiding the UAE at a time when the economy was rapidly exploding and growing. I mean, the early 2000s were a time where the city of Dubai was, you're seeing skyscrapers thrown up, every week. The city of Abu Dhabi was seeing an enormous increase in its revenue from oil and gas. You were seeing just an incredible amount of economic activity prior to, of course, the 2008 global financial crisis, which created a lot of negative repercussions for the UAE as it did for countries all over the world. But Khalifa bin Zayed was there as president for a really key transition period between his father, Zayed, who's viewed by Emiratis as sort of the father of the nation, really like the key founder of this, the modern country of the United Arab Emirates. He was really bridging between that period of time, the founding of the country, and bringing it into the current modern era, of which very clearly Mohammed bin Zayed, crown prince and ruler of the UAE, and the one who is expected to formally become president in the coming weeks, he really was the sort of transition person, the transition leader between that. So he is beloved. There will be a period of mourning, certainly beginning in the coming days. I think it's starting tomorrow. And he will be viewed as sort of the face of that period of time between the founder, Zayed, and what the UAE has become today, which we could discuss forever, is really a country that hits above its size in terms of regional geopolitics, global geopolitics, oil markets, financial markets. A lot of people know about the UAE, even though it really is this tiny country. And Sheikh Khalifa was part of bringing the UAE into prominence.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's like Sheikh Khalifa is only the second president of the UAE. And, for people who aren't familiar, the UAE it's a federation of seven emirates, and these emirates were drawn up by the British on their way out the door in the colonial period. And then this is the only Arab federation that's ever actually lasted. And it's also lasted through two notable transitions. There's other federations that have been tried, Egypt and Syria was the most famous one, and they don't last very long. So the UAE is one of those countries that stands out in the Middle Eastern experience as a place where this alliance between royal families has worked. And that's what's so notable about not just that Sheikh Khalifa has now passed on, but that there does appear to be a clear succession that's not going to result in the breakup of this country. So there's some longevity to the system that they put together. And it's a weird system, because when you say president, you tend to think democratically elected. He's not democratically elected. They're elected by the rulers, the other six rulers of the other six emirates.
Because
it's a small election. It's a very small voting sample.
Right.
And it's always unanimous as well. But it really does go to show how this the longevity of what the UAE set out to do. It's still sticking around now to its third president.
Definitely. And I was just going to say logistically, uh, just jumping off of what you said about the election, logistically in the coming days, that federal council, which is the leaders from each of the emirates, will be meeting, and they will be electing the next president. But it is right, Ryan. It's a foregone conclusion that it will be Mohammed bin Zayed as the next president. Correct?
Right. Yeah, pretty much we can just expect that over to just as a fait accompli, because Abu Dhabi still controls all the oil wealth. It controls the federal budget. And although the UAE is a federation, so the United States is also a federal system. Unlike in the US system, all of the other Emirates are fully reliant on Abu Dhabi's oil wealth to keep the lights on and keep people paid. So at the end of the day, we can fully expect Mohammed bin Zayed will be the next president. And as a result, there won't be a whole lot of overt changes, at least not in the near term. But the thing we're looking for is who's going to be the next crown prince of Abu Dhabi, which has traditionally been the role of who's now number 2, who will then eventually become the president. And there's no reason for us to believe that this cycle will be any different, that whoever is named crown prince will be the successor to the UAE's presidency. And we still don't know who that is. And we don't really, we really don't. We have a short list of people we could discuss, but at the end of the day, the Nayans are a bit of a black box. There's been no public statements of who's going to be the next crown prince, but that certainly will matter, won't it?
It really will. And it gets to the sort of unique politics of these Arab monarchies, and a reason why they are so fascinating for the many expatriates who live in these countries, because the politics is a unique blend of an opaque sort of oligarchic system that rests in the hands of families, of royal families, that have for decades, centuries even, controlled the politics and sort of wealth of these of the Arab Gulf states. And this is the case in Kuwait. This is the case in Saudi Arabia. This is the case in Qatar and Bahrain. And it's interesting because you have that opacity, but you also have a system of consensus and argument and debate and discussion within the families. And that's sometimes we get insight into that, and sometimes we don't have any insight at all. As you mentioned, that's the key question on people's minds is, okay, there's continuity expected with respect to Mohammed bin Zayed, but what about who's going to take his position? I've seen names. I'm sure you've seen names. Hazza bin Zayed Al Nahyan is one that's been suggested as a likely successor, and he has a lot of responsibility. He was a national security advisor. But really, this is a very large family, the Nahyan family. There's a lot of branches to it, and it's not immediately clear who's going to succeed in that position. But I totally agree that for the Emirates, for their economic goals, for their political functioning, everything is largely going to feel the same, even after this period of mourning following the passing of Sheikh Khalifa. But it's really within those gatherings of the royal family, most of which the outside world is not at all privy to. That's where they're going to be discussing, okay, who is best suited to sort of take the reins of this very powerful position of Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi.
Right. And we should note Mohammed bin Zayed is about 61 years old. And that means that he will probably be in charge for 10, 20, even 30 years. Some Gulf leaders do have that kind of longevity. So we're still looking at decades before there's a transition. But part of the reason the Crown Prince matters is Sheikh Khalifa represented a transition period between, Sheikh Zayed was he was in charge when the country was developing from the ground up. He was bringing electricity and water. Khalifa was then bringing more advanced services and tourism. And Mohammed bin Zayed will be pushing for a knowledge economy and a post-oil economy. And that will be his goal. That will be his legacy, is whether or not he succeeds or fails in that regard. And his successor will be the one who lives with that legacy in all likelihood. I see we have a question here, which is interesting, this one. Will we have any impact on leadership equations in the GCC? Probably some of the relations. And, in the short term, at least my personal answer to that is that we're not going to be seeing anything change too much. because Mohammed bin Zayed has already been running the show since Sheikh Khalifa's stroke in 2014. But in the long term, especially with the crown prince position, depending on the person who takes that over, they'll have a chance to start to build out their own relationships across the GCC and start to posture for what the post MBZ UAE strategy might be. And that is something that will be very interesting to note. And it'll also be interesting because Mohammed bin Zayed comes with some reputational baggage from the Yemen intervention, from the Trump years, and the close relationship between MBZ and some Trump administration officials, some of which is still working its way through U.S. courts. A new crown prince can turn the page on that. And they can also bring with them, as we've seen with Saudi Arabia, an impetus to different kinds of change, a new personality coming in and saying, you know what, now we're going to try this social change, this economic reform, and it's going to be my name on it. Like we've seen with Mohammed bin Salman, he's brought social change at a grand scale, and that's all part of his kind of cult of personality. And so a crown prince will have that chance to build that up or not, depending on how Mohammed bin Zayed, who he decides to appoint and how he decides to manage it. But Emily, I'm curious if you think that there's anything, if you think anything differently, or how you might see the succession affect GCC relations.
Yeah, it's a keen question because, of course, the interpersonal dynamics between these rulers of the Gulf monarchies really has an impact on how this region acts as a whole in sort of global geopolitics. And I do agree with you that right now, because Mohammed bin Zayed has been running much of the country's affairs, certainly with family consensus, because that's how the system works. But he has been the leader, and that's expected to continue for years, as you say. It's not going to be a dramatic shift in terms of the UAE's relationship with Saudi Arabia or with Kuwait or with Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, all those really important other GCC states. However, it's interesting because one reason we pay attention to succession in these states so closely is, even though you have continuity that lasts for a long time that you might not have in a country like the United States, where we do have elections, that bring new leadership to the fore quickly, and you can have administrations turn over in a matter of 4 years, and so there's less political continuity. So even though that's not the case in these countries that are ruled by royal families, you do, when there is a succession, you do have the possibility for dramatic shifts that sort of alter what you've seen for years and years and years. So perhaps the more timely question, this would have been a really timely question to ask in 2014 when it became clear that, okay, the president of the UAE is going to be using, relying on other members of the government, like the crown prince, to sort of run the country. But I do think over time, the relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which is a really key one, leading the GCC in terms of political decisions, leading the GCC in terms of economic reform measures that matter across the whole region in terms of taxes and visas and trying to diversify their economies. Those changes all depend on the personal relationships between these leaders. So the next crown prince is going to be building those relationships. I mean, just look at Saudi Arabia and the fact that when we talk about the key leadership there, we often talk about the crown prince of Saudi Arabia and not the king himself. They're both critically important, but it's the crown prince that sort of like leads a lot of the economic reform measures. So I do think it's an open question for who that crown prince is. Is he going to become a voice that's very strong one way or the other for a certain direction in terms of economic reforms or political reforms? Because we are seeing incremental sort of additions to things like the Federal National Council, the body in the UAE that is elected and does have representation across the Emirates, pulled from across the Emirates in sort of a semi-democratic body. Those are places where you could see small changes over time as the Emirates grows and changes and becomes more and more modern.
And we got another question here, kind of talking about Will MBZ continue to lead everything, or will he start to take a back seat? So, I mean, one of the important things is that traditionally in the UAE, none of the presidents were able to ever take all the portfolios. Even Sheikh Zayed, who was running a relatively simple economy and pretty straightforward foreign policy, still delegated. So we can expect that, and it will be very interesting to see what the new crown prince's delegations are. Mohammed bin Zayed was given the security. He was the supreme commander of the armed forces. He was able to take over the diplomacy. Sheikh Khalifa tended to focus more on internal dynamics and balancing between the royal families and being a steward of tradition. So it'll be interesting to see who this next crown prince is and what they're charged with, and the background that they've got. Because, if we have Sheikh Tanoon, who has been a national security advisor, if he is appointed the crown prince, it might suggest that Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed is going to focus a little bit less on the national security front and might focus on some other aspect of leadership. He certainly will have to be thinking more and more about the other 6 emirates as the president of the country. On the other hand, he could delegate a crown prince to focus on domestic affairs while he continues to focus on foreign ones. And that will be a change. Mohammed bin Zayed has been able to kind of run his own affairs abroad, without too much check for a substantial amount of time. Will he choose to continue to do that going forward, or will he decide that the country's interests are best served in placing a new personality in charge of at least some of those portfolios and allowing them to develop that skill set, so that when he passes on, there will be a successor who will be able to carry on his vision. That's going to be something that we need to keep an eye on. But we should expect that, I think, Mohammed bin Zayed will step away from some things or choose not to take up others that Khalifa, or at the very least Khalifa's advisors, were overseeing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. What do you see happening in some other, when there's something like this happen, when something like this happens, it makes you think about the other Gulf monarchies as well. What do you see is interesting to watch in terms of other succession questions in other Gulf monarchies?
Whenever you say succession questions, the ones that really matter is watching King Salman in Saudi Arabia, who is advanced age. He's in and out of hospital. He is in the same kind of rumored poor health that Sheikh Khalifa was. And that's a big open question of what changes and how fast once Mohammed bin Salman is no longer crown prince, but King Mohammed. And that could also be an interesting change in the GCC, because once King Mohammed takes power, and there is President Mohammed in the UAE, and they've had a very close relationship in some areas, and they're also very economically competitive with one another. Both compete, they have such overlapping development strategies that they have to be in competition with one another, even if they personally get along pretty well. It'll be very interesting to see, once we have King Mohammed bin Salman, how he decides to assert himself. How fast does he, for example, normalize with Israel? How hawkish does he remain in Yemen? What kind of social reforms does he decide to push forward? And how does he pursue the economic competition with his neighbors, with Qatar and the UAE? With Qatar, part of the incentive for the blockade was to undermine its economic development model. And that didn't end up working, but that was part of his approach, was this is how we can undermine Qatar, and thinking, how can he drag talent out of the UAE, and how can he get companies to move to Riyadh from Dubai? All of those things will become of greater prominence and possibly greater assertiveness once that succession in Saudi Arabia takes place.
And I might add to that too, looking at some other GCC states that have experienced successions recently. Kuwait is one. The longtime beloved leader passed. And also in Oman, that was a couple of years ago now, but that was also a very recent shift, especially for a country like Oman that had been led by the Sultan for 40 years, and then now has, it's still easy to think of him as a new leader, even though he's sort of been in government for years and years and years. But those, I think, are two interesting examples of how you can see continuity after succession or some slight changes. I'd say, and this is just speaking from 30,000-foot view, but in Kuwait, you've seen a lot of continuity, a lot of political continuity, especially from the royal family and from the sort of unelected officials in government. There's a lot of turbulence in Kuwait in the elected parliament, which we could talk about at another time. But in terms of what's coming out of the royal family, and the top leadership in the country, it's been largely the same. And Kuwait has maintained things like its position of neutrality and as its sort of fame for being a place of mediation within the Gulf region. In Oman, I do think you've seen, and you and I have talked about this, we've seen some signs of the Omani government growing a little bit closer politically to Saudi Arabia as well as to the UAE, in a way that I don't think Oman was prior to the succession. And that is really, really interesting when you think about the sort of slow shifts that might be happening over time in these states, where some changes, especially economically, you see happen so rapidly, and some changes politically and socially take a lot longer to occur. So that's just a couple examples of why we watch succession in these countries very, very closely.
And we're also, it's really interesting to think about, these are generations of leaders. And Khalifa was born in the 40s. So Mohammed bin Zayed was born a little bit later. But they were born in that generation of people that were coming up with oil and were able to travel and experience the world. But they also grew up in a geopolitical situation where it was the Cold War, and that mentality of choosing between West and the Soviet bloc. That was what made sense for a foreign policy. And now Sheikh Mohammed will be taking control of a country that is entering a multipolar world, in which there's not necessarily clean lines in the sand, and we're already seeing that with the Emirati strategy towards the Russian-Ukrainian war. They're taking Russian oligarchs and taking Russian investment, but they're still hosting Ukrainians. They're trying to maintain price stability in the oil market. It's going to be very interesting to see how these leaders' mentalities and the way that they were taught how to manage foreign policy is implemented in these coming years, because now the world that they grew up in is long gone, and they have to adapt to circumstances where choices aren't always as simple as just choosing between West and East. And sometimes their imperatives drive them back home, where they have to focus on the home front and perhaps care a fair bit less about what foreign capitals think.
And I would be remiss, as we're sort of winding down the conversation, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, with your experience having taught as a teacher in this country for several years, do you see any shifts, whether it's related to Sheikh Khalifa's passing or not? Do you see any shifts in the coming years with respect to the knowledge economy and what the Emirates is achieving and trying to achieve in that realm? I mean, what do you see in the future for the Emirates?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because so I was teaching in the for our viewers, I was teaching in the Abu Dhabi public schools. So it was government run schools, and we had to do things like National Day, and Sheikh Khalifa's portrait was up everywhere, especially on national days, and it was part of the country's national identity, is that they were attached to their leaders. And that was that political glue that held these disparate tribes together. And I think that with Mohammed bin Zayed taking over, we're now entering a phase where that tribalism matters a lot less, where that family connection matters a lot less, with the knowledge economy, where people have to have specific skill sets to be successful, is becoming more and more of the norm. And kind of a symbol of that change is, I'm just talking to somebody in Dubai who's heard about the day of mournings. When Sheikh Zayed died in 2004, the country shut down for a month and a half, and there doesn't seem to be that moment where the UAE will shut down completely. They won't just declare 40 days of no business happening whatsoever during this phase, because the country has changed. There's an imperative to keep businesses open. There's an imperative to continue working, even as the country is going into a state of mourning. The way that the country has changed since Sheikh Khalifa took power in 2004 means that some of these old traditions and values are simply just not economically feasible, or not necessarily a priority. And I think that's all by intent. I think that's very much what the Emirati leadership wanted to slowly evolve, and we're starting to see it play out. And as Sheikh Mohammed takes over, that will be kind of the social material that he has to work with to carry out his own goals of more modernized, a little bit more of a nationalistic, nation state style citizenry, rather than the tribal, very religiously minded, very conservative folks that Sheikh Khalifa ruled over, especially in his early years.
So the trajectory of those more business-friendly reforms, foreign investor-friendly reforms, the things like, even in the last day, we've seen news that there's unemployment insurance in the Emirates. and that was not something that existed when you and I worked there.
Mm-hmm.
Also, they changed recently the working days, and when I was
Right.
working in the Emirates, the work week was Sunday through Thursday, and now it's shifted sort of more in line with um, international sort of standard for working schedules outside of the Middle East. Um, those kinds of things, it sounds like you expect to largely continue moving forward.
Right, exactly. This is going to become a country that continues barreling down towards modernization as it defines it, and it'll be a fusion between old values and new values. And but from the economic sphere and the business sphere, it's going to look more and more like working in a place like London, rather than the Middle East. And I think that is both Sheikh Khalifa's legacy as well as Sheikh Mohammed's now as the nominal leader. That will be his goal.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, Emily, thanks for talking to me about
Yeah,
something like
thank
this.
you.
We rarely get a chance to talk about timely things like this. So yeah, we're going to continue tracking leadership changes within these countries. We're going to be continuing monitoring how they're navigating between the multipolar world that they're emerging in. And I think you and I will probably be spinning up something to write about this subject, and in the near future. And yeah, if anybody's interested, please visit stratfor.com and subscribe to Worldview, and see what our analysis is up to.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right. Thanks, Emily. Bye.